Thank you all very much for joining us once again on this Monday. There is much happening in the Middle East on multiple fronts this week. We're following, of course, the war in Gaza. Israeli forces are being very forceful right now, both in Khan Yunis and maybe even going towards the border with Egypt, Rafah, which is the critical area and key to demilitarizing Gaza as we move forward. Of course, the clocks are ticking. This war is taking a long time. The hostages and their time, of course, is huge sensitivity in Israel, as you're following on the news. There's also talks of the Saudis entering the picture again sometime this spring, but there's an American political calendar as well. This also translates into the politics in Israel, the questions about a new reformed Palestinian Authority, whether you believe in that or not, and many, many, many other issues on the table. In the North, Israel, as you know, has been hitting back harder. There were Iranians that were killed this week, according to the international press. So that is heating up as well. And the entire region, with Iran attacking both Pakistan or ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria, Pakistan hitting back at Iran, and and of course, the Houthis, and you're watching serious rounds of UK and US military attacks there as well. So this is the Middle East today, and we are going to try to make some sense out of all of this. And we have a wonderful high-level discussion for you today. You know what's happening in Europe. You know about the EU vote. You know what ELNET is doing. So I'm going to go straight to introducing our very able director, CEO of ELNET UK, Joan Ryan. Joan, the floor is yours to introduce our speaker and topic. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody. Well, good evening from London. It's probably not evening where you are, but it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jonathan Spire. Jonathan, welcome to the ELNET Zoom. Jonathan is a journalist, an author, and an analyst of Middle East affairs. He's director of the Middle East Centre for Reporting and Analysis. He's a research fellow at the Jerusalem Centre for Strategy and Security, a fellow of the Middle East Forum, and editor of the Middle East Quarterly. Jonathan is a columnist at the Jerusalem Post and a contributor to the Wall Street Journal and the Australian newspapers, and a freelance security analyst. He has extensive experience as a correspondent in the field and has reported on conflicts from Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Turkey, Ukraine, and Israel, West Bank, Gaza. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. You've been following the trouble around, Jonathan. But last week you were with us here in London and addressed members of Parliament on these issues. Listening to you then, I thought this would be a really good session for the Friends of ELNET. So can I start by just raising with you, you will know that Khalil Shakiki, he has a research company, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, and he's just published, or just recently published, the findings of its latest survey into Palestinian attitudes. This survey was undertaken right close to the end of December. And what that tells us is something I think really very worrying. 750 adults were interviewed face-to-face in the West Bank, and 481 were interviewed in Gaza, also in person. The Gaza data collection was done during the recent, truce, when it was a little safer for researchers to move about. The survey's got a 4-point margin of error rather than the usual 3-point. But what it found was that 72%, that's almost 3/4 of all respondents, believe Hamas's decision to launch its attack on Israel on October the 7th was correct. So less than a quarter, 22%, said it was incorrect. Now, Khalil is at pains to point out that doesn't mean support for the atrocities. and that no one should see it as that is his view. However, that is quite overwhelming figures. Would you talk to us about your analysis on how people, Sunni Muslims, are voting when they get the opportunity to vote, and their view of Hamas and other proxies of Iran?
Yes, thank you very much, John, for the question. First of all, probably many of our listeners are aware, but it's worth pointing out that Khalid Shkaki is a very reputable and well regarded pollster. So there tends to be a kind of automatic skepticism, sometimes justified. People say, well, but how can you do real polling in those environments where there are authoritarian governments and so on? Khalid Shkaki is somebody who more or less is universally regarded as a person who should be listened to carefully, who's a very serious and professional pollster. So this is, first of all, with regard to his findings. With regard to what he actually found, yeah, first of all, I don't think we should be surprised by this. And the reason why we shouldn't be surprised by it is because the only polls that really matter, which of course are actual elections, entirely bear out the pattern that he appears to, be observing in its present moment, namely that when Sunni Arab populations in both the Levant, a term which I still find useful, that's to say Israel, PA territories, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and Iraq and Egypt, that's to say a kind of uninterrupted crescent of territory, huge crescent of territory stretching from the Iraq-Iran border all the way down to Egypt. Throughout that territory, which is a territory of very large Sunni Arab population, the Sunni Arabs are not the majority throughout that area. They're not a majority in Iraq. They're not a majority west of the Jordan River. They may not be a majority in Lebanon, though we can't really look, but they're a massive population. Throughout that territory, without exception, whenever the Sunni Arab population has had a chance to vote or a chance to organize politically in context of insurgency and war, they have chosen, without exception, options which represented one or another form of Sunni political Islam, or of Sunni Islamism, if we prefer that term. That's to say, when the population of Egypt got the chance to vote, only once so far in a real free election, but they got a chance to vote in 2011, 2012, they, as we know, voted for the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi, which then lasted a year and was removed in a military coup by the Egyptian army in July 2013. When the Palestinians got the chance to vote, again, only once so far, in 2006 for the PLC, for the Palestine Legislative Council, famously, the victor in the vote was Hamas. In Syria and in Iraq, where there isn't really voting, now in Iraq there kind of is, but that's another discussion. In Syria there isn't. In Syria, when an insurgency broke out against the Assad dictatorship, and the insurgency was based overwhelmingly on the Sunni Arab majority population, around 60% of Syrians are Sunni Arabs. As we know, the rebellion, initially celebrated in the West as the Free Syrian Army and a rebellion for democracy and against dictatorship, rapidly took on the coloration of Sunni political Islam, became dominated by Islamist militias. And lastly, since we're doing the kind of geographical tour here, lastly, as we move over to Iraq, we discover, whether we like it or not, but we need to look it in the face, that the most potent and notable political military initiative of the Iraqi, to come out of the Iraqi Sunni Arab population since the downfall of Saddam Hussein, was the thing that calls itself Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Daesh or ISIS. This is worth, by the way, mentioning that, we tend to look at ISIS sometimes wrongly as a kind of phenomenon that sort of fell out of the sky, just representing pure abstract evil and wickedness. It certainly was an evil and wicked organization, but it didn't fall out of the sky. It fell out of the Iraqi Sunni Islamist context. That's where it comes from. It emerged from the Iraqi branch of Al-Qaeda. So what that tells us, if we're looking at the evidence, is that all the way from Egypt over to Iraq, inclusively, without exception, the people that actually, unfortunately, control the sentiments of the mass of Sunni Arab population are one or another form of political Islam, stretching from the Muslim Brothers in Egypt to Hamas among the Palestinians, to ISIS among the Iraqis, at least for a moment. I'm not saying ISIS has majority support of Iraqi Sunni now, but for a moment it was very popular, to the Sunni Arab Islamist rebels in Syria, which tells us that these are the ones who control sentiment on the ground. The other point to note is that, of course, all these organizations and movements and parties have been unsuccessful. If we think about the last decade and a half for the Sunni Arabs since the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, what we see are Sunni Islamist manifestations again and again and again in context after context. The Muslim Brothers as a party in Egypt, the Sunni Arab insurgency, the ones I listed, all manifesting themselves, enjoying massive popular support, and ultimately being defeated. The Muslim Brothers removed by the army, the Sunni Arab Syrian insurgency defeated by Assad, the Islamic State defeated by a US-led coalition, and Hamas contained in a little tiny enclave in Gaza by the overwhelming strength of Israel Defense Forces and Israeli security structures. So to conclude the point, or this first response, Sunni political Islam enjoys immense and unchallenged popularity at street level throughout the Arab countries I mentioned. Not necessarily all Arab countries, not the Gulf, North Africa, but where we're talking about. And at the same time, it proves itself again and again unable to actually organize for victory and end up ruling for any appreciable amount of time, usually because it goes too far, takes on enemies that are too big for it, and ends up getting crushed. But even when it's crushed, it does not then lose, apparently, the support of the public. The public still, apparently, when they get a chance, tend to favor those organizations. And that is the reality which we are currently facing, I would say, in the region. Not a simple one at all. It's one of managing a situation where political Islam continues to enjoy enormous popularity. I guess I answered at length on Sunni political Islam, so I won't go in right now on the issue of Iran and Iran's proxies, which is kind of a parallel but different discussion, but I'll certainly be happy to comment on that as we continue the conversation.
It's quite. Is it possible you could fix your camera? You look a bit like a ghostly figure to us. I don't know.
So we had a bit of fun with that before. I'm currently in the UK. I'm not at home, so it's a bit difficult for me. So this is kind of what we got. I'm afraid it'll have to be a ghost speaking.
Okay.
As long as you can hear me, okay, then
we can hear you. But yeah, we can see you too.
That's
you just
important.
look a little bit ghostly, but yeah, we can see you. And that's quite a depressing picture, really, isn't it? Given that, despite what's going on, I think ultimately, when people talk about the day after and things, we want to look for the hope in this situation, the way forward. Hamas don't represent it, but we've made very clear many times, and many people have, that this is about what's going on now. What Israel needs to do is prevail against Hamas and drive Hamas out. Can you speak to that? Hamas, not the Palestinian people. What do Israel really need to happen in terms of Gaza? And what do you think the time scale is?
Yes, well, with regard to Hamas, let me just say, regarding the first point you made, you're right. I mean, it's not, the picture I was painting a moment ago is not one that makes any of us sort of jump in the air with joy. At the same time, to some degree, as analysts, our job is to try to locate reality, tough as it may seem. The fact is that one interpretation, and I think a decent one, of what led to October 7th was precisely that our strategists and policymakers at both the security and political level, by the way, I'm not exonerating anybody in our camp, at both those levels, refused to look reality in the face with regard to Hamas. That's to say, they thought that they knew better than Hamas what Hamas stood for. To be very honest, I mean, Sinwar, a very terrible enemy. But from a certain point of view, Sinwar did everything he could to telegraph to us what he was about to do. It was widely reported in the Israeli media just under a year ago that when Sinwar gave a speech saying his men were coming to eat the hearts and livers. That's a quote from Sinwar, to eat the hearts and livers of the settlers joining Gaza. Right, so he did his best in his own inimitable way to let us know, but we preferred to think that we knew better than Sinwar what Sinwar actually thought. So what we did was we listened to that and said, yeah, that's him showing off and him, acting out because he knows he can't do that, so he's trying to sort of posture for his public, etc., etc., etc. And we made a big mistake. So I would suggest that we, it's our job, if we're going to do this job effectively, to look reality in the face and not kid ourselves as to what the reality is, because by kidding ourselves, we got October 7th. That's to say the catastrophic failure of analysis at the top level then led to all the various tactical and operational decisions that ended up, with 750 soldiers defending on the morning of October 7th against 3,000 terrorists coming across the border. So gloomy as it may seem, I think we have to look at the reality in the face, or get another job, get a happier job, being a kid's entertainer, wherever. It's all good, yeah? But if we want to do this particular line of work, it requires looking reality hard in the face. With regard to Gaza and its future, my own view is the following. I do think there's much work going on behind the scenes, which I think probably many of the people on the call are also aware of, to try to do two things. One is to work with and develop local sources of authority on the ground in Gaza, in the complex society that is the Gaza Strip. And secondly is to try to persuade friends or partners in the Gulf to invest in the process of reconstruction of Gaza. The issue of the future role of the Ramallah Palestinian Authority in that picture remains an unresolved one. I would have thought, from my own personal point of view, that it is likely it will have one role or another in Gaza. The continued Israeli security presence in the Strip, as the Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear, is a must from an Israeli point of view. It doesn't mean that we want to see Israeli soldiers patrolling in Gaza City, of course, but it does mean that we probably do, or I think certainly do want to see a situation like the one that we have in the West Bank, where Israel doesn't police the streets of Ramallah, but if it is absolutely necessary for Israel to go in for a security reason, to arrest a suspect, a terrorist planning an attack, then Israel has the capacity to do so. Israel gave that up in Gaza with the disengagement in 2005. I'm convinced that any post-war arrangement in Gaza, which Israel will favor at least, will involve Israel once again having that capacity, as it reacquired that capacity in the West Bank after Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. Of course, there is a massive question mark over all this. This is me sitting here saying, well, these are all the things we'd like to do after we finish the war. All of this, of course, is predicated on the notion that we do, in fact, finish the war successfully. What does success mean? It means, in the first instance, very clearly and concretely, that the Hamas governing authority in Gaza ceases to exist. That doesn't mean that because then people like to try to say, what do you mean you can't defeat an idea? You can't kill every gunman? The answer is, yeah, that's absolutely right. Those 2 points are right. So let me reiterate. It's about the Hamas governing authority ceasing to exist. Lots of people in their homes in Gaza may still believe in Muslim Brotherhood ideology. There may be groups of armed young men who believe in it too, but that governing authority needs to cease to exist. The way that Islamic State ceased to exist after the US-led coalition and its Kurdish fighters on the ground entered the last town of, it's called Baghuz, in the southern part of Deir ez-Zor Governorate in southeast Syria in the summer of 2019. In they went. Islamic State as an entity was over. Lots of people still supported its ideology. There were still some men with guns who wanted it, but the authority was over. We have to achieve that in Gaza to bring any of what I said 2 minutes ago into the realm of the possible. And it's not clear yet, by the way, if we want to be frank about it, that we will get to that point. I personally sincerely hope we will. As everybody's said since the beginning, there are a number of clocks ticking. Those clocks are not necessarily aligned with one another. The hostages clock, the diplomatic clock, and the military clock. So we have to move forward quickly if we want to get to that stage before the diplomatic clock rings and, it rings time's up. That's what experience should teach us. We're in the midst of that right now. We need to get to that point. Once we get to the point, if we get to it, then the options I spoke about a moment ago will come onto the agenda, and I hope they will come onto the agenda.
So the clock that the Americans are following, if America decides that the diplomatic clock, the time is up, they want Israel to move to a full, complete ceasefire, What do you think will happen? Will Israel do that, or will Israel carry on with a war where the noise is quieter, but it's continued because they haven't yet finished the job? And we hear a lot that they need at least 9 months more to get that complete, to ensure that they prevail over this Hamas authority.
Yeah, first of all, with regard to the time frame, I mean, I very much agree with that. You know, again, just as a student, and as many of us probably listening are students of insurgency in the Middle East in recent years, we remember that you know, the war against Islamic State is probably the closest parallel to the current war. It took a US-led coalition 9 months to get ISIS out of Mosul, out of the largest city in Iraq that it conquered. Of course, famously, the war against Islamic State took the US coalition 5 years to successfully conclude. They did successfully conclude it, but it took them 5 years. We, of course, are not trying to take as massive a swathe of territory as they were trying to take. The city of Mosul is roughly of equivalent size and nature, minus the tunnel system, of course, which makes our situation more complex than that of Mosul, but roughly comparable. It took the coalition 9 months, you know, without the tunnel system. They didn't have to deal with that to get ISIS out of Mosul. So yes, 6 to 9 months. That's what people have spoken about. I think it's absolutely realistic. In terms of, yeah, will we get that time from the Americans? Well, it's very complex, isn't it? Or very problematic. The United States is going into an election year in 2024. We know that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is furious with President Biden because of his staunch, and it has been staunch, support for Israel since October 7th. We know they'll be threatening all kinds of threats about, well, we're not going to encourage people to vote for you. If people don't vote for you, it'll be your own fault. Don't come and blame us. We're already hearing this from the left-wing edge of the Democratic Party, firstly. Secondly, Biden and those around him, clearly, not because of pressure from outside, because of their own conception, are very determined that this war should not expand, should not escalate. And there is a possibility that at a certain point, they will prefer to allow our enemies on the larger canvas to kind of get away with a bit more than they should get away with, rather than take the kind of tough and harsh action which needs to be taken as they enter into an election cycle. So yeah, we can't take for granted that we've got all that support from the Americans indefinitely, which is why I think we need to move quickly. Will Israel just ignore the United States and continue regardless? I mean, it depends. Look, at a certain point, if the United States really do want to bang on the table and say, guys, time's up, it's kind of hard to imagine a situation in which Israel just says, yeah, well, maybe for you, but not for us. You know, history shows us most of Israel's wars end before Israel would want them to, and they end because the Americans shout, time's up, and then a United Nations Security Council resolution rapidly follows. That's how the 1973 war ended. That's how the 2006 war ended. One way or another, that's probably how this one will end too. But the only question is if that happens after we've achieved the key goal of destroying the Hamas authority or before it. And it's not yet totally clear, at least in my mind. You know, it's not really possible to predict exactly which way that will go. Can I just add also, by the way, I mean, certainly the media today, the Israeli media today is full of reports, which I'm sure you, Joan, and others have read, that there is currently a plan for the end of the war being floated, or at least discussed, between Qatar and Egypt and the US administration. And that according to this plan, at least I only know this from reading Amos Harel at Haaretz, this is not a revelation of secret information, but according to what Amos Harel, who's well connected, is suggesting, and the Wall Street Journal also reported on this on Sunday, I believe, the plan would be for a 90-day process in which there would be a 3-phased Israeli release of Palestinian security prisoners in return for the release of Israeli hostages. The final phase being that of release of men of military age and serving soldiers held by Hamas. And the end of that 90 days would see an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the resumption of negotiations. Let me be absolutely frank, at least from my own point of view. If Israel were to agree to that, Israel would be agreeing to its own defeat. That plan is a plan for Israeli surrender, basically, because what we'd be saying to Sinwar is, right, you carried out October 7th, Israel kind of went crazy, sent 4 divisions in, you kind of withstood those for 90 days, Israel then withdrew, and Sinwar got up and planted the flag on the rubble. That would be disastrous from an Israeli point of view. So some of the diplomacy is not encouraging. But we'll see. You know, there's still everything to play for, I would say.
Shall we move briefly to talk about what people refer to as the Northern Front? Many concerns have been expressed about whether this will be a war on two fronts. Some might say it's already that. There's been a lot of incursions across that border from Hezbollah in Lebanon. But also, now we've seen the action that the US and the UK took against the Houthis. So are we talking about the potential for a war on three fronts, a really regionalising of this conflict situation? What would you say about that? I know you have interesting things that you say about that Northern Front and who it includes. Is it Lebanon or is it further afield?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to be clear on, is of course there isn't yet a war on three fronts. I mean, there is a war on one front, which is Gaza, where, you know, there is a kind of all-out fight to the death, so to speak, taking place between a number of IDF divisions and Hamas fighters. Nothing of that kind of all-out variety is yet taking place in the Northern Front, i.e., as you correctly point out, Lebanon and elsewhere, we'll discuss in a moment, or the Southern Front. But, you know, forces are engaging on those two fronts too, and a lot of people are dying. Let's just, in terms of, let me talk about the Northern Front for a moment, as you asked. Let us be aware that, you know, 170 Hezbollah fighters have died since October 8th, which was the day when Hezbollah entered this. That's not nothing, right? Hezbollah only admits to losing 250 fighters dead in its war of 2006, which it regards as a divine victory and so on and so forth. So 170 dead in this is by no means nothing. You know, I'm certainly not sort of mourning or wailing or gnashing my teeth because of them being dead. I'm just saying that the fact that they've died is something of note. Something, I'm trying to remember the figures now, 9 Israeli soldiers and 6 Israeli civilians have died too. 19 Lebanese civilians and also 19 members of other terror groups on the Hezbollah side have died. So, you know, there's been a fair amount of killing on the northern border since October 8th. As you mentioned, my view of the Northern Front is a broader one than the one which is sometimes discussed in Israeli media. We tend to say the Northern Front, and we mean the Israel-Lebanese border for understandable reasons. But I think if we look deeper, we have to broaden that view, because actually, in my view, the Northern Front consists of the entire geographical area stretching from the Israel-Lebanon front all the way to the Iraq-Iran border. That's to say, taking in 3 nominal Arab states, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, all of whom have the following thing in common. All of those states, well, the following 2 things in common. In all of those states, the so-called central government does not, in fact, enjoy unrivaled and complete authority in the area of which it supposedly rules. And that's true both politically and militarily. And in every one of those so-called nominal countries, there is a very strong or dominant Iranian political and military interest. These countries are all different, of course. And so the form in which Iran has inserted itself into the country in question is different. In Lebanon and in Iraq, there is a nominal representative political system. That's to say, real elections of a type take place. There is, in fact, a parliament. The parliament, in fact, chooses the government. So in those contexts, the Iranian interest is both military and political. Lebanese Hezbollah, which is the dominant political and military force in Lebanon today, is the prototype of that type of Iranian activity, political and military activity. Lebanese Hezbollah dominates Lebanon. In Iraq, in a comparable, much larger situation, the Iraqi-Shia militias, the Hashd al-Sha'bi or popular mobilization units, are the dominant political and military force in Iraq. When I say dominant politically, I mean that the government of Prime Minister Mohammad Shia Sudani in Iraq is dependent on the support of the Iranian militias in their incarnation as political parties. And in Syria, where of course you don't have anything even resembling elections, you just have a dictatorship, the Iranians have modified their approach. So there they have militias which are hooked into important power centers in the Assad dictatorship, up to and including Maher Assad, the younger brother of President Bashar Assad, who also commands a thing called the 4th Armored Division, a very powerful military formation in Syria. So in all those areas, and they are contiguous areas, of course, stretching from Iraq-Iran border to the Mediterranean Sea and Iraq-Iran border to the borders with Israel, in all those areas, the Iranians have very powerful instruments. And those instruments are working in unison with one another. And they have a contiguous area of freedom of movement, all the way from the Iraq-Iran border to the Mediterranean Sea and Iraq-Iran border to the borders with Israel, which means that when we think about the Northern Front in all this, we're not talking only about Israel-Lebanon border or even about Israel-Lebanon and Israel-Syria borders. We're talking about a massive hinterland stretching back through political and military power and freedom of movement all the way to the Iraq-Iran border. And we see this in practical terms. That's to say, for example, the Iraqi-Shia militias on at least 2 occasions deployed on the Syrian-Israeli border have fired ordnance into Israel. And we see it in the way that Israel's fighting back as well. Israel's fighting back all the way across Syria, attacking Aleppo airport and Damascus airport and other nodes of movement maintained by these forces. And if we think about the targeted killings which have been attributed to Israel since the beginning of the war, we see the way in which Israel clearly thinks about this front in the way that I just described. Okay, Defense Minister Gallant, who I met with a number of times prior to his becoming defense minister and discussed this sort of stuff, I know that this is the way that Gallant also looks at the space in question. And if we think of the people that allegedly Israel is targeting, you know, all the way from Wissam Tawil and what was his name, Ali Hussein Bujri of Lebanese Hezbollah, you know, via Salah al-Aruri of Hamas in Beirut, but maybe most importantly of all, General Razi Mousavi of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, an Iranian general targeted allegedly by Israel a couple of weeks ago. We see that Israel also is seeing this front as a single unified whole. By the way, an Iranian friend of mine who I spoke to on this matter a couple of days ago here in London reiterated to me a point that I've heard from some others and people maybe have heard also, which is that it's very difficult to overestimate the importance of General Razi Mousavi. This was not just some random Revolutionary Guards guy that Israel decided to kill. Many people regard Mousavi as having been the most important Revolutionary Guards commander since the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani, and many of them say he was actually a more important figure, Mousavi, than the current alleged head of the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards, Ismail Ghani. So it's a very, very major figure taken off the table by somebody or other, allegedly Israel, in recent days, which shows us that Israel is seeing the Northern Front as a holistic unit, and correctly is seeing it as a single front commanded by or controlled by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Iran has been preparing for this moment for many years. That's why it has inserted itself so deeply into these Arab countries. So Israel is facing a very major challenge. And just lastly on this issue, let me remind everybody that this is not only an Israeli challenge. There have been no less than 130 attacks by the pro-Iran militias that I've just been talking about on American positions in Iraq and Syria since October 7th. The Americans have 2,500 service personnel in Iraq, and they have 900 service personnel in Syria. And these people's positions have been subject to ongoing daily attacks by the pro-Iranian militias since the war broke out. Nobody's been killed yet, but that's because the guys spend their time in shelters. It's not because the Iranians are just, firing pea shooters. Yeah, it's because the Americans take very great care to ensure nobody does get killed. But people have suffered traumatic brain injuries. People have suffered life-changing injuries, American service personnel, as a result of these attacks. So the Iranians are quite boldly using this nexus of this militia nexus to supply Hezbollah, to seek to attack Israel, and also to attack American deployments in that area. And that's the way I would characterize the Northern Front of the picture that we're looking at.
Thank you, Jonathan. And a very comprehensive answer, and I think a really interesting one about the way we conceptualize this and how the Middle East looks to Israel. Can I ask you one last question, and then I'm going to open it? We've got people listening today who are keen to ask a question. So I just wanted to move does peace lie with the Gulf states? Just how much do the Saudis and the UAE want Israel to win? And will then the peace only be able to happen with their commitment? And if that's the case, we've talked before about who amongst the Palestinians can be the partner for peace. if their involvement is part of the price that the Saudis and UAE need Israel to pay?
Yes, first of all, with regard to the Gulf states, I do believe that successful and peaceful development in our region, in lots of ways, does rest on the Gulf states for reasons I'll go into in a moment. But just so with regard to the war, they want Israel to win. Yeah, they surely do. Let me reiterate or state very clearly the following. Israel and the United Arab Emirates, with whom, of course, Israel now has a full diplomatic relation since August 2020, have a similar list when it comes to listing the threats facing them in the region. But whilst you may well find the same items on the list of both countries, they won't be listed in the same order. What do I mean by that? From an Israeli point of view, very clearly, the main problem is Iran and the Iranian proxies and the Iranian nuclear ambition and Iran's desire to dominate the region. The Emiratis calibrate it somewhat differently. They are worried about Iran, but they are primarily worried, for their own good reasons, primarily by Sunni political Islam, and most specifically by the Muslim Brotherhood, who the Emiratis are deeply concerned about, and they were deeply concerned or even frightened by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood just over a decade ago. And my sense, at least, is, the history books will teach it better, but my sense, at least, is that the Emiratis probably played a key role in the military coup of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt in July 2013, which was the moment when the advance of the Muslim Brothers was broken in the Middle East. So the Emiratis, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed is a supremely sophisticated and able operator on the regional level. And he it is, I think, more than any other single individual, has been responsible for stopping what was once described as the inexorable advance of the Muslim Brothers across the region just over a decade ago. So thinking about it from a point of view of a person like that, when Israel is now, locked in a desperate fight against the local franchise of the Muslim Brothers, which is what Hamas is, it's very plain to see that UAE, will of course be behind Israel's cause in that respect, and we'll be hoping that Israel delivers a very serious blow to Hamas. And I think Saudi Arabia, please, yes.
Well, just Irene Adler, who's on the call today, she's wants to come in on a question that very much relates to what you've just said. So Eileen,
Sure.
Are you there? Would you like to put your point to Jonathan?
Sure. So the question is there any way that we can actually shift the narrative of, the fundamentalists of these different groups? Because it seems like it's gaining more and more traction.
Back to you,
yes.
Jonathan.
Well, I would say in response to your that the way we do that is by building an effective and successful alliance between ourselves and those Gulf countries that we were just talking about. I think that the future of the region is going to be continued competition between ourselves and the Iranians and their allies, at least for as long as the Iranian regime survives. But I think what the Abraham Accords show, and what's been shown subsequently, is that there is an emerging powerful alliance of the good, if I can put it that way, of people who want to have a constructive future for the Middle East, who oppose extremism, who oppose political Islam. There is an emerging alliance of that kind, and Israel is an integral part of it, and the Emiratis are, and the Saudis will be, and the Republic of India, as we go further east, is a natural part of that as well. In other words, that natural sort of flow that goes from India via Emirates and the others across to Israel and the Mediterranean and Europe, that's the kind of axis which is going to be, I think, the future of the Middle East, presenting a more positive economic and political and societal model. If that can be built and successfully defended and advanced, then as it shows, as it grows and continues, more and more people, I think, will flock to its banner. I don't think that there are many people in the Arab world, I think, who would like to see an alternative, but who maybe are frightened or intimidated by the forces of political Islam. It's up to us to try to help those people find their voice. But the way we'll do it ultimately, because it's the Middle East and this is the way things work in the Middle East, is by being strong and powerful and successful ourselves. If we and our allies can raise our banner such that we are seen and perceived as victorious, as flourishing, and as successful, then people will rally to our cause. If we are seen as defeated and declining, then people won't be interested in us. That's the key lesson of our of our neighborhood. So the answer is yes, but the way we'll do that is by continuing political and military and diplomatic success. With regard to what you asked also, Joan, before the final question, part of your question about the Palestinians. Yeah, my view is, I mean, frankly, is the following. I mean, Hamas clearly, as we said, has to be destroyed as a political authority. The Ramallah PA, is not without some potential in a way that Hamas clearly is not. There is successful ongoing security cooperation between Israel and the Ramallah PA in the West Bank that does keep things quiet to a certain extent. But if somebody believes that the Fatah movement, which lies, of course, behind the Palestinian Authority, can be a partner for a final status accord and the ending of all further historic claims between Israelis and Palestinians, I have to tell you that I personally am skeptical because of the nature of that movement and what it itself is looking for. I do believe that the best possible hope, what we should be thinking about, is ways in which we can introduce our Gulf friends with their power and their resources and capacity into the Palestinian space, and the way in which we can encourage local, authentic, representative leadership in the Palestinian areas. And some form or another of those factors joining together is, I think, the best possibility in terms of successful political development on the Palestinian side. But on to some level, we can't impose that. You know, if at the end of the day, if given a chance, the people in the Gaza Strip or West Bank prefer to go with Hamas, then the reality is going to be one of continued conflict. And that's not unimaginable either. You know, the Middle East can often turn out that way. Let me just say one more thing on this, without comparing ourselves to other Middle East power centers. You know, the fact is that elsewhere, more broadly in the region as well, there isn't consensus. There is support for political Islam, and there is a kind of uneasy balance of power between populations or parts of populations that support political Islam and political and military authorities that oppose them and try to stop that from getting through. So we shouldn't be utopian here. We should be aware of the climate and conditions in which we live, and we should adapt our behavior and options to those realities. But certainly something between our Gulf friends, their resources, their will to be involved, and authentic local Palestinian leaderships, and the combination of the two, it seems to me is the way forward in this.
If I may just, quick thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. I'll come back to you. I just want to, we've got about half a dozen people now who are hoping to get in on a question. So can I ask Eli Al-Yashmani? Eli, are you there? Would you like to put your question?
Yes. First of all, I'm so stressed by the role that Iran is playing, but I want to ask you a question on a tangential question. The embedding of correspondence with the fighting on October 7th. First of all, is that an allowed thing within the correspondence? And if not, are there any consequences? Have there been any consequences for those who joined the 3,000 terrorists on October 7th and invaded Israel?
First of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, the evidence indicating that people who were involved, who were there on October 7th, included individuals who acted as stringers for or photographers for major Western news outlets. And of course, it goes without saying, also Palestinian news outlets. Absolutely, yes. In terms of consequences, yeah, I wouldn't be able to give you an exact list off by heart, but I know that there have been a number of people who were stringers for New York Times and CNN and others, and I think also AP or AFP, where the companies have said, yeah, we're no longer using the services of this or that individual. Of course, there should be much greater consequences than that. As to whether there have been any attempts by Israel to locate or apprehend those people, I'm not aware of any of that. It may be going on. I'm just personally not aware of it. But yeah, sure. I mean, it's a really important question because it brings up a larger point, which is that, you know, when Western journalists try and do media work inside the Palestinian territories, it's really important to understand they're not operating in a democratic environment where there is a tradition of free media. They're operating in an environment in which local fixers, local photographers, local stringers will regard themselves as, you know, agents of the Palestinian cause rather than journalists first and foremost, and that will skew the coverage, the resulting coverage, at least for as long as correspondents are willing to play the game or correspondents are sufficiently ignorant to not realize that they're being played. So yes, absolutely. I think it's an important point, and I think it's something which deserves further consideration.
Thank you, Ela. Great question. Can I go to Esther Kandel? Esther, you there? Esther?
Yes. Hi.
Sorry.
Can
Hi,
you hear
Esther.
me?
Yeah,
Okay.
you
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much. This is unbelievably interesting. However, with regard to the actual question of Hezbollah, that was a very interesting regional analysis, but I know you're not the general. Do you see an actual war coming? That's question number one. Understanding the whole regional conflict. And number two, do you see that Israel was kind of stabbed in the back by this plan, as I read myself yesterday in the Wall Street Journal and Amos Harel has reported? Is that not a chutzpah on a complete about-face by America, not including Israel, and ending a war that they promised they would back Israel till the end?
Right. So with regard, thanks, Esther, for the question. With regard to two questions, with regard to the first one, is war coming? Whilst I do not have a crystal ball, I would say the following. Yeah, it's difficult for me to see how the current situation, which is an unacceptable situation, can be dislodged and moved at this stage without some form of Israeli military action in or over Lebanon. Let me tell you why, for the four reasons. As you know, 86,000 Israelis have left their homes as a result of the events of October 7th, in the north of their homes as a result of the events of October 7th and Hezbollah rocket and missile attacks that followed it. Communities all the way to 5 kilometers south of the border have effectively been emptied. I've been up there a number of times as a journalist. It's a wasteland. It's a war zone there. Now, it's true to say that about 100,000 Lebanese in the south of Lebanon have left their homes too, but that doesn't give you a kind of balance here. In the old days, when I was not so long ago, 10, 20, 30 years ago, Israel imposed a security zone north of the border in southern Lebanon. Right now, it looks like Hezbollah has imposed a kind of security zone south of the border in northern Israel. That's a new development, and I don't think it's one which Israel can accept. And I know that leading Israelis, including, because I read it in the media, including Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, do not regard that as an acceptable situation. The 86,000 Israelis have made very clear in every forum available to them that they're not willing to go back to their homes unless the state of Israel can guarantee to them something like security. Something like security in their eyes does not include, and this is not a metaphorical point, it's what I've seen with my own, I've been told about and seen the place where this took place, does not include Hezbollah fighters literally being deployed all the way down to the border fence, sometimes meters away, literally meters away from Israeli family homes in such places as Kibbutz Rosh HaNikra or Moshav Shtula and other places I'm sure people on the call know about. So something has to change. Now, Amos Hochstein, the United States President's special envoy on Lebanon, has just been in the region trying to work out a diplomatic formula whereby Hezbollah would agree to remove its forces. Initially, they said north of the Litani, which is about 30 kilometers at most of the border. Now they're saying about 10 kilometers. The impression everyone's getting is that Hezbollah has simply refused unsurprisingly, any such diplomatic arrangement or inducement of that kind. If you have a situation where American diplomacy has failed and Hezbollah remains in its situation of attack and 86,000 Israelis remain outside of their homes, at a certain point, the state of Israel and the government of Israel will have to do one of two things. One is saying, basically, that's acceptable. We don't mind. We'll just, I guess, do something like massively beef up the conventional military presence in the northern border area and say to residents, well, it's safe to come home, so anybody who wants to come home should do so. That doesn't sound to me like a viable or livable situation. It sounds to me like a strategic setback for Israel, which it wouldn't be able to accept. Either has to accept something like that, or military action has to be taken to try to drive Hezbollah by force north of the Litani, or at least some way north of where it's currently located. By the way, people talk about international law. It's worthwhile restating. Hezbollah's presence south of the Litani is utterly and absolutely contrary to international law, to United Nations Security Council 701. But that doesn't seem to excite many people in the West. You know, Hochstein came, and from what I could read in the media, at least, of what people were saying, he was proposing that Israel begin discussion with Lebanon, i.e. Hezbollah, over the future of 13 disputed points along the border. Now think about that for a moment. What Israel was actually being asked to do was to accept Hezbollah's unilateral breaking of a United Nations Security Council resolution, and in return to begin to discuss further territorial demands that Hezbollah apparently has. So it's a nonsensical situation, and it would seem to me it's not viable. I personally hope our government doesn't accept it viable. To dislodge it, it would seem to me some form of military campaign north of the border becomes necessary. I don't think that'll be happening immediately soon, but I think it is coming, because I don't think there's any other way to resolve that situation. So the short answer to your question is, do I think is war coming? The answer is yes, I think it is. I think that's where the reality leads us towards. And regarding your second question, very briefly, do I regard it as a stab in the back? Well, I think I already characterized it in my own words in what I said about it. I think that if Israel were to accept the plan, at least as we've read about it in Wall Street Journal and Haaretz, that essentially would be an Israeli surrender document, at least as it looks like in Wall Street Journal and Haaretz. It's an Israeli surrender document. So I don't recommend that Israel accept it, not at all.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther, for the question. Can I go to Larry Hochberg now? Larry is our founder and our chairman. Larry.
To shift the conversation just slightly, we keep hearing that in the Emirates, for example, and Saudi Arabia to a less extent, all they show on their media and television, etc., in those countries is the bombing that goes on in Gaza. Almost nothing about the slaughter in South Israel. Isn't that an insurmountable boundary to getting the people behind a strategy which you describe? I mean, what does that mean? Please.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good observation. Look, the point is this: you know, what we've had since 1979 with Egypt and what we've had since 1994 with Jordan are cold peace agreements in which the civil society and media and education system remain implacably anti-Israel. And at the same time, because of the pragmatic self-interest of the regimes, we work pretty successfully with them, and we do work pretty successfully with them. With the United Arab Emirates and with Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit better than that in the following sense. There have been breakthroughs. We have seen, for example, as I'm sure you're aware, Larry, that there have been major reforms in the Emirati education system to remove, and indeed in the Saudis as well, to remove some of the really blatant anti-Semitism that was there before. But it's an absolutely very, very high mountain, which we've only taken a few meters up along with the Gulfies. We should not exaggerate the capacities here. There is a possibility, I think, for pragmatic cooperation. It is based on two things. One is Israel's strength, and it is therefore dependent on Israel's maintenance of its continued strength. And secondly is Israel's economic potential. Both those elements make us an attractive partner for the Saudis and Emiratis. And for those pragmatic reasons, the leaders there, MBS in the Saudi case, of course, and MBZ in the Emirati case, want to cooperate. We should not jump from that to place so much weight on this and assume that, you know, they like us now and they're going to help us now. So yeah, it would be great if that were the case, but that's not the case. We have what to work with there. It still remains a vastly imperfect situation. And let me add to that, there's even an additional caveat to the optimistic picture regarding the Gulfies, which is the following. These are fairly fragile countries. These are not powerhouses in the military or strategic sense. You know, the Marine General Jim Mattis, I believe it was, described the UAE as little Sparta on one occasion. That deserves to be on a list of the most, you know, astonishingly optimistic statement characterizations ever made. UAE is not little Sparta. The Emiratis are hostile to the Iranians, but they're also terrified of the Iranians. The Saudis also to a great extent. So, you know, these are powerful countries economically. They're full of potential for us. We shouldn't be kidding ourselves, though, about the broader point here. Without any question, the Saudi public, and I think probably the Emirati public as well, are sympathetic to Palestinians. They are Arabs after all. They are Muslims after all. They belong to that broader political culture, and they're sympathetic to the Palestinians. At the same time, two things. One, the practical self-interest is as I described it. Secondly, the tradition in both those countries is to tend to do what the king says. They may be sentimentally attached to the Palestinians, but if the king says to do X, the people will tend to do X. That's the way those countries work. So yeah, it's by no means an ideal situation, but it is a situation in which we have what to work with. That's how I would characterize it.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Larry, for the question. Can I think this will be our last question, and it's from Rick Weinstein. Rick, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hi, Rick. Would you like to put your question?
Yes, thank you very much for discussing this with us. I find it fascinating and upsetting, I'm sure, as everyone does. Iran is obviously pulling the strings between Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and if we don't address the underlying cause of these problems, which is Iran, we're not going to be able to fix anything long-term. Short-term, we can fix, hopefully, what's going on in Gaza and some other local locations. But how do we deal with Iran long-term? How does the United States deal with Iran long-term? Obviously, concessions to them and giving the money back was a mistake, and I'm glad we stopped that in time. But how do we put pressure, or will it come down to an actual physical strike against Iran, or something that has to be done to get Iran to stop basically fostering anti-Israel war?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rick. First of all, let me say absolutely clear: this thing ends when the Iranian regime falls. It's, at the end of the day, the big picture disorder and dysfunctionality, which we're discussing here, certainly in terms of we talk about Hezbollah or the Iraqi-Shia militias or the Assad regime militias and so on, this will end conclusively, and the Houthis put them in the list as well, when the Iranian regime itself falls. It is the head of the octopus, I think our ex-Prime Minister Naftali Bennett used to put it. Yeah, there are other, that's a fair description. So it ends when they fall, and even on a level below them falling, because we can't just make them fall when we wish it so. It will get better insofar as they are intimidated, pressured, and impoverished. So how do we achieve that? And that's a question of degree, right? Not of kind. How do we impoverish them and intimidate them and make and turn them back? Well, there are economic aspects to that, of course, renewed sanctions and real sanctions with regard coming back into place with regard to their violations of the nuclear deal and with regard to their interference in the life of other countries. First, secondly, I think political and military pressure. Political pressure. The Iranians are vulnerable politically. Iran is not a powerful country internally. In 2019, on the eve of the pandemic, Iran was beset by demonstrations on an economic basis throughout the country. We saw it just in the most recent episode between Iran and Pakistan, that Iran is vulnerable to the terrorism of part of the Baluchi minority, the Jaish al-Adl organization that hit in Kerman, the hometown of Qasem Soleimani. So Iran is a riven, deeply divided, deeply mismanaged society, which means it's full of potential for anybody who wants to subvert and undermine the rule of the Islamist powers there. I very much hope and believe that we as Israel, as America, as the Gulf, should be getting into that business. Iran has been setting fires in our backyard for the best part now of 4 decades. There is massive potential for setting fires in their backyard and keeping them occupied in Iran, rather than them having time and bandwidth to bother us in Lebanon or Syria or the West Bank or Israel. We should be busy with that, and we should be taking that very, very seriously indeed. This is the second part. And the final part, which you also mentioned, is there should at the very least be a credible military threat to Iran. Whether or not we actually have to use it, hopefully the whole point of a credible threat is that hopefully you won't have to use it, right? But if the threat is not credible, what you invite is further aggression from the Iranians. It's maybe a good point on which to end the discussion as well. It's a crucial point. If the Iranians come to believe that the United States administration simply has a kind of ceiling to its willingness for escalation against them, then what that will do is invite further Iranian aggression, most importantly against commercial shipping in the Red Sea, which could cripple the global economy, or certainly powerful elements within it, and also in Iraq, also in Syria, also in Gaza, West Bank, and Israel. If, however, they believe that if they push it too far, America may, in fact, and Britain and Israel may, in fact, strike them in Iran, that is the way to disincentivize them. But the threat has to be credible. Right now, I am worried that the Iranians are looking at the Biden administration, at its going into an election year, at its apparent willingness, to keep on the current level of pressure against the Houthis, even when it's not delivering the goods against the Houthis. And that means the Iranians will think they've got lots more room to maneuver and make problems. So they need to be informed, or to make clear to them that there is a credible military threat against Iran itself, not against the proxies who the Iranians couldn't really care less about if they get killed, but against Iran itself. And that, I think, is frankly a crucial, maybe even a historical question and challenge, which is now facing the US administration and its allies.
Jonathan, thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Sia Kurdistani, who's our West Coast organizer. Sia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joan. And thank you, Jonathan, for this very enlightening, very informative briefing that I think demonstrates extreme complexity of the security challenges that Israel faces today. And on that note, ELNET has been taking solidarity delegations to Israel since October 7th. We have done 11 so far, which have comprised of nearly 150 members of parliament and other influential European leaders, including senior journalists and other opinion influencers. We have 5 more scheduled in February. We're taking the delegations not just to the south to tour the devastation caused by Hamas terrorists on October 7th, but also to be briefed by the IDF, and as well as be taking to the north to be briefed on the security situation that continues to escalate between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel and Iranian-backed forces in Syria as well. So by the end of February, we will have taken nearly 250 members of parliament throughout Europe, including members of the European Parliament in Brussels, as well as other influential decision makers and opinion influencers, including journalists. We need the resources to continue this important work. We need your support. Please visit elnetwork.eu/donate to make a tax-deductible contribution today. We thank everyone who supported us in 2023, and we need you for 2024 as well. Your support could not be more important than it is now. Thank you, everyone, and please stay tuned on an announcement for our next speaker next week, Monday, which will be sent in a couple days. Thank you again, Jonathan. We really appreciate your briefing. We appreciate everything you contributed today. And thank you so much, Joan, for moderating. And thank you to our supporters for your wonderful questions and important comments and questions today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.